They told me my graduation party looked like a yard sale. 3 weeks later, they were begging security to let them through a gate they no longer had access to, while I stood on the other side wearing a ring worth more than the house I grew up in. I'm Maya. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my life I thought love in my family just looked different than it did in other families. Quieter, colder, more conditional. I told myself that was normal, that some families just weren't huggers, weren't the type to say, "I'm proud of you," out loud. I spent years building elaborate excuses for people who never once tried to make me feel like I belonged in my own home. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a neighborhood with manicured lawns and country club memberships, where my parents, Diane and Russell, cared more about how things looked from the street than how they actually felt from the inside. My older brother Holden was the golden child from the moment he was born, and I was the afterthought, the daughter who happened to come along 18 months later and never quite earned the same warmth. Holden got the bigger bedroom, the new car at 16, the unconditional applause at every Little League game even when he struck out. I got told to stop being so sensitive when I cried about being left out. By the time I was an adult, I had built a life that had nothing to do with them. I worked as a labor and delivery nurse at a hospital downtown, a job that exhausted me in the best way, that let me hold newborns in the middle of the night and remind myself that not every family started out broken. I had my own apartment, my own car, my own quiet, steady life that nobody in my family ever asked a single question about. And then there was Caleb. I met Caleb at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital during a string of back-to-back overnight shifts that had left me running on fumes and bad decisions. He was sitting at the counter with a laptop and a black coffee, wearing a faded gray hoodie and jeans that had seen better days, and when I dropped my badge on the floor trying to juggle my bag and my drink, he picked it up before I even noticed it was gone. We started talking. He told me he did something with software, which I later learned was the understatement of the century. He asked about my job like he actually wanted to know the answer, not like he was waiting for his turn to talk. We exchanged numbers, and 3 months later we were inseparable. I never once thought to ask what he did for a living beyond software, and he never offered more than that. He paid for dinners sometimes, but never extravagantly. He drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a crack in the windshield he kept meaning to fix. He wore the same 3 hoodies in rotation. If you had told me he was anything other than a mid-level programmer scraping by, I would have laughed. My family met him exactly once before the engagement, at a Sunday dinner I'd been dreading for weeks. My mother set the table with her good china, not for Caleb, but because Holden was bringing his fiancée, Brielle, a woman who worked in pharmaceutical sales and never let you forget it. Brielle arrived in a dress that cost more than my monthly rent, dripping in jewelry, talking loudly about the lake house her parents were gifting them as a wedding present. My mother hung on every word like Brielle was reciting scripture. Caleb sat next to me in his quiet way, answering questions when asked, complimenting my mother's cooking, not pretending to be something he wasn't. My father barely looked at him. At one point, my mother asked what Caleb did for work, and when he said, "I run a small software company," she gave this little laugh, this dismissive huff of air, and said, "Oh, that's nice, dear," in the exact tone she used when the mailman told her about his hobbies. Holden made a joke about Caleb needing to get a real office job if he wanted to keep up with the family. Brielle laughed too loudly. My father changed the subject to ask Holden about his promotion at the insurance firm. I remember looking at Caleb that night, watching him absorb every bit of it without so much as a flinch, and feeling this hot shame crawl up my neck, not for him, but for them. I apologized to him in the car afterward. He just shrugged and said, "Families are complicated," and squeezed my hand, and I loved him more in that moment than I think I ever had before. We got engaged 4 months later. I called my mother crying tears of joy, and her first question was not congratulations, it was, "And what exactly does he do again?" I told her the truth, that he ran a small software company, careful with the word small, because that's the word he always used himself. And I heard her sigh through the phone like I'd just told her I was marrying a man on parole. Planning the wedding became its own slow humiliation. I didn't want anything extravagant. Caleb and I both agreed on something intimate, a backyard ceremony at my aunt's property out near Lake Wiley, string lights in the trees, a few dozen people we actually loved, a caterer who did barbecue instead of some 5-course plated dinner nobody would remember. It felt like us, it felt right. My mother hated it before I even finished describing it. "A backyard wedding," she repeated, like I'd told her we were getting married at a gas station. "Maya, people are going to talk. Brielle's wedding is going to be at the Ritz." What is everyone supposed to think when they hear my daughter got married in someone's yard? I told her this was what Caleb and I wanted. She told me I was settling, that I'd clearly internalized some idea that I didn't deserve better, that maybe if I'd pushed Caleb a little, he could have at least sprung for a real venue. I didn't bother explaining that Caleb had offered, more than once, to pay for whatever venue I wanted, and that the backyard had been my idea, my dream, not some consolation prize. She wouldn't have believed me anyway. In her mind, the size of the wedding was the size of the love, and by that math, I was settling for crumbs. The dig that cut deepest came 2 weeks before the wedding, at a family barbecue I almost skipped. Holden and Brielle had just announced their engagement party, a black tie affair on a private yacht out on Lake Norman, complete with a string quartet and a guest list that included half my father's law firm. My mother spent the entire barbecue talking about the menu, the open bar, the calligrapher she'd hired for the place cards, like she was planning the wedding herself instead of an engagement party 3 months before the actual ceremony. When I mentioned that my own wedding was the same week, she waved a hand like she was swatting a fly. "We'll see how it goes," she said. "I mean, a backyard, Maya. It's a little embarrassing if I'm being honest. People are going to compare it to Holden's, you know that, right? It's just going to look trashy." Trashy. That was the word my mother used about my wedding, in front of my father, in front of Holden, in front of Brielle, who didn't even bother to hide her smirk. Nobody at that table defended me. Not my father, who just kept flipping burgers like he hadn't heard a thing. Not my brother, who had spent 31 years watching our parents treat me like an inconvenience and never once said a word. I sat there with a paper plate of potato salad going warm in my lap and felt something inside me go very, very still. I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I just nodded, said something about needing to check on the dessert table, and walked away before anyone could see my face change. That night I told Caleb everything, the whole conversation, word for word, and he listened the way he always did, quiet and steady, his jaw tightening slightly at the word trashy, but otherwise giving nothing away. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Do you want me to say something to them?" he asked. "No," I said. "I don't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing it got to me." He nodded slowly, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite place, something almost like he was filing the moment away for later. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too busy trying not to cry into my dinner. The day of Holden's engagement party arrived, and my mother texted me a photo of herself in a sequined gown, captioned, "Wish you were here to see this, sweetheart, it's just gorgeous." I didn't respond. My wedding was 4 days away, and I had a final dress fitting to get to, a million tiny details to nail down, a life to build that had nothing to do with her approval. The morning of my wedding, the weather was perfect, clear October sky, the kind of crisp fall light that makes everything look like a painting. My aunt's backyard had been transformed overnight, string lights woven through the old oak trees, white folding chairs arranged in soft rows facing an arch wrapped in eucalyptus and ivory ribbon, long farm tables set with mismatched vintage china I'd spent months collecting from estate sales because I thought it was beautiful, because it told a story, because it was mine. My parents and Holden showed up an hour before the ceremony, and I watched my mother's face as she took it all in. The string lights, the barbecue smoker already going behind the property line, the casual elegance of it all. She didn't say it looked beautiful. She said, "Well, it's certainly rustic," in a tone that made it clear rustic was just a more polite word for trashy. I let it go. I had exactly one job that day, which was to marry the man I loved, and I wasn't going to let her steal it from me. The ceremony itself was the kind of beautiful that makes your chest ache. Caleb cried when he saw me walk down the grass aisle in my simple lace dress, no veil, just wildflowers in my hair. My best friend Naomi, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself, that's not right. My best friend from nursing school, a woman named Sienna, stood up beside me as my maid of honor, and Caleb's best friend from college, a guy named Theo. No, that's wrong too, let me just say it plainly. His name was Marcus, stood beside him. We exchanged vows we'd written ourselves. I told him he was the first person who ever made silence feel safe instead of empty. He told me I taught him that love didn't have to be loud to be real. We were married, pronounced husband and wife under string lights as the sun started its slow slide toward the tree line. And for about 20 minutes it was perfect. We danced our first dance to a song that meant nothing to anyone else in the world but us. My father-in-law, Caleb's dad, a soft-spoken man named Gerald who'd flown in from Ohio, gave a toast that made half the yard cry. It was, without exaggeration, the happiest I had ever been in my entire life. Then I heard the first sound of the helicopter. It was distant at first, a low thrum somewhere over the lake, and I remember thinking, with mild annoyance, that someone was flying too close to the wedding for a Tuesday evening joyride. But it didn't pass over and fade away. It got louder, closer. The string quartet faltered. Guests started looking up, shading their eyes against the dying light, and I turned to Caleb with a question already forming on my lips, and that's when I saw his face. He wasn't confused. He wasn't startled. He was watching the sky with the calm, faint smile of a man who had been expecting exactly this. "Caleb," I said, "what is that?" He took my hand. "That's for us." The helicopter descended into the open field beyond my aunt's property line, kicking up a storm of grass and flower petals and napkins from the dessert table, and out stepped two men in dark suits who I would later learn were part of Caleb's executive security detail. Followed by Caleb's actual business partner, a woman named Priya, who I had met exactly once, at a dinner Caleb described as work stuff. She was holding a velvet box. I turned to Caleb, my heart hammering, my dress whipping around my legs in the helicopter wind, and he finally told me the truth he'd been carrying for the entire 8 months we'd dated. "The small software company," he said, raising his voice over the rotor noise, holding both my hands in his. "It's not that small. It's called Hearthstone Health. We build the platform that something like 60% of hospital systems in this country use to track patient records. Maya, I'm worth about $19 billion. I never told you because I needed to know you loved me, not the number." I genuinely thought I might pass out. Around us, the wedding had gone completely silent, every guest frozen mid-motion, every fork stopped halfway to every mouth. My mother stood near the dessert table with a piece of cake on a plate, utterly motionless, staring at the helicopter, at the men in suits, at her new son-in-law, like she was trying to do complicated math in her head, and the numbers refused to add up. Priya walked across the grass and handed Caleb the velvet box. Inside was a necklace, his late mother's, a thin gold chain with a single sapphire pendant, the only piece of jewelry she had owned that survived a house fire when Caleb was 19. He told me, in front of everyone, that he'd been saving it for the day he found someone who loved him before they knew what he had, and that today, watching me walk down a grass aisle, without a single care about anything except him, he knew it was time. He fastened it around my neck himself. My hands were shaking too hard to help. I want to be honest about what happened next because it wasn't graceful, and it wasn't kind, and for a long time I felt guilty about how much I enjoyed it. But I've stopped feeling guilty now. My mother was the first to move. She set down her cake plate and started walking toward us with this bright, brittle smile plastered on her face, the same smile she wore in church, the same smile she wore for the neighbors. "Maya," she called out, like nothing had happened, like the word trashy had never left her mouth 9 days earlier. "Caleb, oh my goodness, why didn't you tell us? This is wonderful, this is just wonderful, I'm so—" "Mom," I said, and something in my voice stopped her cold. "You called this wedding trashy. You said it in front of everyone at the barbecue. You've spent the last 3 weeks making me feel like I was an embarrassment for getting married in a backyard with people I love instead of some rented ballroom." Her smile flickered, then steadied itself, the way it always did when she was recalibrating in real time. "Maya, sweetheart, I didn't mean it like that. I was just worried. You were just worried about what the neighbors would think," I said. "You weren't worried about me. You haven't been worried about me a single day of my life. You spent 31 years making sure I knew I was the disappointment and Holden was the prize, and now suddenly I'm worth talking to because there's a helicopter in the yard." My father had walked up by then, his face an unreadable mask, the same face he wore at every family conflict, the face that said he would much rather be anywhere else. Holden stood a few feet back with Brielle, who had her phone out, already typing something, probably to one of her bridesmaids, probably something about how she couldn't believe this. "This is a lot to process," my father said carefully, in the voice of a man trying to negotiate his way back into good standing. "We're happy for you, Maya, truly. You didn't say a word at the barbecue," I said, "not one word. You just kept flipping burgers while Mom called my wedding trashy, and you let it happen, the way you've let everything happen my whole life." Caleb's arm tightened gently around my waist, not pulling me away, just letting me know he was there, that I could keep going or stop, and either way he had my back. I kept going. "I'm not interested in pretending the last month didn't happen," I told them. "I'm not going to pretend you've been supportive, or proud, or anything other than embarrassed by me until 30 seconds ago, so I think it's best if you go home now. This is my wedding day and I don't want to spend another minute of it managing your feelings." My mother's face crumpled, real tears this time, and for half a second I almost felt the old pull, the lifelong instinct to comfort her, to apologize, to smooth things over so she wouldn't be upset with me. I let the half-second pass. I did not move toward her. "Maya, please," she said. "Don't do this. We're your family. Family doesn't call your wedding trashy and then smile for cameras the second they find out it's profitable to be nice to you," I said. "Goodbye, Mom." Security, the actual security detail that had flown in with the helicopter, walked my parents and Holden and Brielle to the edge of the property, politely but firmly, while my aunt stood at the gate, making sure nobody lingered. I didn't watch them leave. I turned back to my husband, to the string lights, to the people who had shown up for me when it cost them nothing to do so, and I asked the band to start playing again. The rest of the night was, against every odd, magical. We danced until my feet ached. Caleb's father told stories about Caleb as a kid, sneaking off to build little circuit boards in the garage while other boys his age were out playing baseball. Sienna cried so hard during her toast that she had to stop twice to compose herself. Somewhere around midnight, under string lights that had survived a helicopter landing 20 feet away, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Peace. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't, because my mother does not let go of things easily, especially not things that involve money she now believed she had some claim to. The text started the next morning while we were still in bed at the hotel, sunlight coming through the curtains, my husband's late mother's necklace still resting against my collarbone where I'd refused to take it off even to sleep. The first text was from my mother. "We need to talk. This was all a huge misunderstanding. Can we come by the house this week?" I didn't answer. The second text came an hour later. "Maya, please don't shut us out over a few comments. Families fight. We love you." The third text, 2 days later, was the one that finally made me laugh out loud. A short, humorless bark of a laugh that made Caleb look up from his coffee with a raised eyebrow. "Holden and Brielle's wedding is in 3 weeks. We'd love for you and Caleb to come. Maybe we can all start fresh." There it was, not an apology, not an acknowledgement of what had actually happened. Just a calculated pivot, the recognition that the daughter they'd dismissed for 3 decades was now married to $19 billion, and that $19 billion might look very good sitting in the front row of Holden's wedding. I showed Caleb the texts. He read them slowly, his expression unreadable, and then he asked me the question that mattered most. "What do you want to do?" I thought about it for a long time. I thought about the barbecue, the word trashy, the years of being told I was too sensitive when I cried about being overlooked, the way my father changed the subject every single time something painful came up, the way my mother's tone shifted in real time the second money entered the conversation. I thought about 31 years of being made to feel like I was lucky to be tolerated, and I thought about the kind of mother I wanted to be someday, the kind of family I wanted to build with Caleb, one rooted in something other than appearances and conditional love. I texted my mother back exactly 4 words. "We'll think about it." I never responded again. Not to that text, not to the 5 that followed it, not to the increasingly desperate voicemails, not to the message from Holden himself. The first time he had reached out to me directly in over a year, asking if I could talk some sense into Mom, because apparently the silence was making her unbearable to be around. I blocked all of them 3 days before Holden's wedding, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. I finally understood that I didn't owe them access to my life, just because they'd finally decided I was worth having in it. Caleb and I spent Holden's wedding day on a quiet beach in the Outer Banks instead, just the 2 of us, eating fish tacos from a shack near the pier and watching the tide come in. I didn't think about my family once until that evening, when I checked my phone and saw a single text from an unknown number, which turned out to be Brielle, of all people. "Your mom cried through half the ceremony asking why you weren't there," it read. "Just thought you should know." I looked at that message for a long time, then I turned my phone face down on the towel and watched the sun go down with my husband's hand in mine, and for the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel guilty for choosing myself. It's been 8 months since the wedding. I haven't spoken to my parents since the night the helicopter landed in my aunt's backyard. Holden has reached out twice more, each time with the same vague, performative concern that has nothing to do with actually missing me and everything to do with whatever he's hoping I'll fix for him. I haven't responded to either message. I still work at the hospital, still pull overnight shifts in labor and delivery, still hold newborns at 3 a.m., and remind myself that love doesn't have to come with conditions attached. Caleb still wears his faded hoodies on the weekends and drives that same cracked windshield Civic to the farmer's market every Saturday morning, because $19 billion never changed who he actually is, the same way nothing my parents said ever changed who I actually am. Last week, my mother sent one final text, the longest one yet, full of apologies that read like they'd been drafted by a lawyer, full of phrases like "we never meant to hurt you" and "we just want to be part of your life." I read it twice. Then I did something I never thought I'd do. I typed out a response, 3 words long, the same 3 words I gave her the morning after my wedding when she begged to be let back in. Too late, Mom. I hit send, and I watched the little gray bubble change to delivered, and then I set my phone down on the kitchen counter, and my husband wrapped his arms around me from behind, and outside our window the sun was setting over a life I built without a single person who ever called it trashy.